It's time we meet the ultimate hoarder of the Bravely Default job lineup, the Spell Fencer. The Spell Fencer is a very unique job, being able to imbue their weapons with elemental properties that grant the ability to take advantage of their enemies' weaknesses in combat. The magic that the Spell Fencer has access to is very similar to that of the Black Mage, with a hint of White Mage sprinkled in, setting the Spell Fencer up as an aggressive attacker with both physical and magical coverage. Let's start this off by talking about the Spell Fencer's specialty, Anti-Magic. This specialty grants the Spell Fencer a 50% defense increase to magical attacks after being hit by a magic attack. While the Spell Fencer is not naturally fragile thanks to their above average HP and vitality stats, the built-in bonus defense to magic is a super useful trait to have, as it increases their survivability even further. Do note that Anti-Magic will only activate with magic attacks, as ailments like Blind or Poison will not trigger the effect. So before we get into the Spell Fencer's combat abilities, I quickly want to discuss how exactly sword magic works, as it isn't entirely clear from the in-game descriptions. After imbuing your weapon with a specified element, we'll use the fire element as an example here, the user can now exploit the fire weakness of an enemy. Hitting the weakness of an enemy has a natural 50% damage increase to your attack. Under the influence of sword magic, your attacks are counted as both a physical attack and a magical attack, so both of these stats are taken into consideration when calculating the damage output of the sword magic. Because of this, there are a few ways you can outfit sword magic into your composition. For example, the monk job has an exceptional physical attack stat, but an egregious magic stat. The monk will see no damage bonuses from their low intelligence, but thanks to their high strength and the built-in 50% damage increase for hitting a weakness, the monk can still take advantage of sword magic. And on the flip side, a job like the Black Mage, which has a very low strength stat but a high magic stat, can also take advantage of sword magic. Their intelligence plus the weakness bonus more than makes up for their lack of strength, meaning, yes, you can utilize sword magic to give your casters the option to use their basic attack. There is a lot of versatility to this job command, and I'm sure there are builds and strategies that no one has thought of that utilize sword magic. But enough of this lesson, let's jump right into the Spell Fencer's combat abilities with the main elements that sword magic covers. This encompasses 5 of the 7 elements in the game, similar to the Black Mage. In fact, the Spell Fencer has access to every elemental spell that the Black Mage has, sort of slotting the Spell Fencer into a physical, single-target version of the Black Mage, focusing their onslaught of attacks on a specified target rather than a group of enemies. This grants the Spell Fencer a huge advantage against a considerable number of opponents, and even bosses, being able to focus on their weaknesses and rip them apart before they even knew what hit them. Of course, be wary of enemies that can drain or block certain elements, as your sword magic will not bypass those barriers. But in return, sword magic can pierce through the Reflect spell, making it difficult for certain bosses to halt a Spell Fencer's oncoming attacks. Do note that your spells do count as buffs to your character, which means that they can be dispelled, requiring you to recast your sword magic. All sword magic spells last for a maximum of 10 turns, so use your turns wisely before you are forced to re-up your magic. One extra thing to note about sword magic before we continue is that if you have a weapon equipped that already currently has an element tied to it, the sword magic will overwrite that element. Next on the list of spells is ailments. This category includes the likes of Poison, Blind, Silence, Fear, and Death. The Spell Fencer can imbue their weapons with these ailments to apply the ailments to their opponents, though the chances of these effects triggering have not changed at all from their black magic counterparts. Since certain enemies can be a pain in the butt if not silenced, and sword magic goes to reflect, the silence spell can be quite effective. Poison can also see some use since most bosses don't resist poison, allowing you to tack on that extra chunk of damage to them throughout the encounter. Blind and Fear can also pull their weight if you find the right window, and the Death spell can instant kill certain enemies and bosses, though if it doesn't activate, the Spell Fencer's damage doesn't really change all that much. And last up on the sword magic list is the absorption spells, Drain and Espear. Both of these spells work wonders when combined with sword magic, as Drain can be used to constantly recover HP with each hit the Spell Fencer deals, and Espear can be used to suck the enemies dry of their MP, rendering certain enemies and bosses completely defenseless against you. Do note that the Drain spell can backfire if you use it against undead, just like the standard spell does. So now let's go over the Spellfencer's support abilities, starting with Firewall. When equipped, the user will retaliate attacks directed towards them with a fire spell. This can be somewhat effective very early on in the game when you don't have access to any high-level spells, but it can very quickly become obsolete when those spells do become accessible. Second up is Auto Espear Blade. This support ability automatically applies the Espear spell to the user's weapon for 10 turns. This support ability can be quite effective when going up against enemies that specialize in using spells, as a Spellfencer can completely remove their means of acting in combat if a spear completely drains them out of their MP. You can overwrite this effect by imbuing any other spell onto your weapon, so it's not like you're stuck on a spear for the whole 10 turns. Next on the list is Magic Armor. This support ability is pretty interesting, as it will grant a resistance to the element that the user has currently imbued on their weapon. This creates an interesting opportunity where the Spellfencer can swap their resistances around in the middle of combat to fit the situation. Really cool support ability that has a surprising amount of utility. Obviously, this support ability does have a blind spot, as you cannot imbue earth or wind elements to your weapons, so keep that in mind. Now we move on to a more niche support ability, with Memento. After the user is KO'd in combat, all other alive party members will restore 50% of their max MP. If this ability didn't take up 3 support slots, I might recommend it a bit more, but I personally see it as too much of a commitment to actually slot it onto any members of my team. But because the effect can be triggered infinitely, there could be a potential use for it as an infinite MP battery. We've come to that part of the video where I tell you that the job specialty can be used as a support ability, yada yada yada. Anti-magic is really good as a specialty, and it continues to be super effective as a support ability due to its defense increasing properties. Not much else to say. Up next is Sword Magic Amp. This ability is pretty self-explanatory, increasing the damage output when under the effect of sword magic by 25% at the cost of doubling the MP needed to cast spells. The bonuses are quite handy, especially since they will scale with the regular calculations of sword magic, making your damage even higher. Next up is Magic Defense Specialize. In lowering your physical defense by 25%, your magical defense will be increased by 50%. Another defense-focused support ability that, while having a bit of a risk factor to it, grants the user an extreme resilience towards every form of magic. With its low support point cost, this ability can completely trivialize encounters against more magical-focused enemies without the drawback of taking up all of your support slots. And finally, we come to Phantom Weapon. This support ability is quite interesting, as it adds the user's weapon attack power to their magical attack power. This can be utilized to boost your magical attack even further, especially if you slot a powerful weapon like an axe or bow on your caster, but it can also be used in a more unique way. Giving Phantom Weapon to a physical-focused job grants them a terrifying magical damage bonus, allowing you to create a monk or pirate caster that can deal an obscene amount of magical damage, while still dishing out high physical damage. Lots of versatility on this one, though it does cost a lot of support points to actually utilize, so keep that in mind. Now it's time to see how the Spellfencer fares as a main job. Looking at their base stats and affinities, the Spellfencer strikes a good balance between offense and defense, being able to output respectable damage, while also being fully capable of taking hits for the team. Thanks to their balanced strength and intelligence, the Spellfencer can make full use of their sword magic kit, granting them an effective damage bonus against any foe with an elemental weakness. The Spellfencer also has multiple defensive tools, both in the form of their specialty and their support abilities that make it difficult to put them down. But the Spellfencer isn't just a one-trick pony, as you can slot them as a decent support caster or a secondary healer thanks to their decent mind stat. The two biggest flaws of the Spellfencer also are tied to their stats. First off, the Spellfencer's pretty slow, as their dexterity and agility stats are their lowest. This can cause the Spellfencer to play catch-up in combat, having to deal with what their enemy does first before they can act themselves. The other big issue is that because the Spellfencer's stats are so balanced, they don't quite excel at anything, allowing other jobs to perform better than they can at pretty much everything, especially with how sword magic functions. The final flaw of the Spellfencer is that it does have a blind spot in regards to elemental coverage, as it cannot exploit wind or earth weaknesses, and needs to rely on other jobs to pick up the pace against those elements. So then, how does Spellfencer fare as a sub-job? Well, I'm not afraid of admitting that I personally believe that the Spellfencer makes for one of, if not the best sub-job in the game. Sword magic is so versatile that almost every single job can take advantage of its effects regardless of whether they are physical or magical focused. being able to exploit almost every elemental weakness with any job is undeniably powerful, not to mention the bonus ailments and drains that can be utilized by certain jobs to keep their HP and MP up as much as possible. The biggest weakness of Spellfencer as a sub-job is that certain physical jobs like Monk or Pirate that want to take advantage of the sword magic the job offers have a decent chance of running into MP problems, as the leader spells aren't exactly cheap. But other than that, there really isn't anything to rag on with Spellfencer. And finally, we've arrived at the fashion tier list, the best part of these videos. So, Tiz's outfit is pretty good. The black cloak adorned with golden ornaments is very elegant, plus the horns on the headpiece are super cool. If I had any complaints, it would be directed towards the sandals, as I'm not a big fan of them, or any open-toed footwear for that measure. It's always been so uncomfortable. It's all a design that captures the image in my head when I think of a Spellfencer though, so high B tier. Now let's take a look at Agnes's design. The belly dancer design choice is pretty neat, and the choice of blue as her color with this outfit is a big win. It just works so well with the outfit. Honestly, my only complaint is a personal one, and that is that this outfit doesn't really seem like a good one for combat. Especially with how tanky the Spellfencer can be, it kind of clashes with the identity. But it's not really a big deal, so A tier for me. I have pretty similar opinions on Ringabel's attire as I do Tiz's, though I am personally not as big a fan of the color scheme. I prefer the black of Tiz's robes rather than the blue one of Ringabel's. But it's still a cool outfit, just not as high of a placement, so B tier. Finally is Idia, and while I do enjoy the outfit, like Ringabel, I feel like Idia's pink color scheme doesn't really match up as well as Agnes's blue. I think a B tier still fits her well, and none of these outfits are outright bad, so good job, Spellfencer.